September the 9th, 1943. 4:37 in the morning. The water off the Gulf of Salerno smells of diesel exhaust and salt and something else. Something metallic that the sailors on the transport ships have learned not to think about too carefully. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring is standing over a situation map in a villa outside Frascati, 300 kilometers to the north, and he has just been handed a report that he reads twice, then a third time, because the words on the page do not match anything in his considerable experience of war. The report says the Americans are unloading, not at a port, not at a pier, not at any fixed installation that his demolition teams had already identified, targeted, and in several cases already destroyed. The report says they are unloading directly onto open beach, in volume, at a rate that should not be physically possible given what Kesselring knows about the relationship between ships and shores and the time it takes to move serious tonnage across the distance between them. His 10th Army is pushing hard toward the beachhead. The perimeter is under pressure. By any calculation he has made, by any calculation any German staff officer has made, the Allied force at Salerno should be running short of fuel and ammunition within the next 48 hours. Isolated, stalled, vulnerable. Except the trucks keep coming out of the sea, not being unloaded onto the beach and then driven away, coming out of the sea, driving, under their own power, through the surf, up the sand, and directly into the supply chain of an army that by all rights should be dying. Kesselring marks the report and sets it aside, but the question it contains will follow him for the rest of the campaign, and the answer to that question had been assembled in factories, test pools, and muddy American proving grounds over the previous 18 months by engineers who understood that the oldest problem in war was not going to solve itself. Parte prima, the oldest problem in war. Every general who has ever planned an amphibious assault has faced the same arithmetic, and the arithmetic has always been brutal. You have ships. The ships carry men and supplies. The men and supplies need to get from the ships to the shore. Between the ships and the shore is water, surf, sand, gradient, tide, and very often enemy fire. The moment your men step off their landing craft, they are separated from everything that sustains them. Every bullet they fire, every gallon of fuel their vehicles consume, every bandage their medics use has to make the same journey, from ship, across water, onto beach, over land, to the front. And the front moves. It moves forward if you are winning, which means it moves further from the beach, which means the supply line gets longer, which means the problem gets worse the more successful you are. This is the iron logic of amphibious warfare. It does not care about courage or doctrine or the quality of your tanks. It is arithmetic. The Romans understood it. The Normans understood it. Every naval power that ever tried to put an army ashore understood it. And for roughly 2,000 years, the solution was the same. Build a pier or capture a port as fast as you possibly can. Get your ships tied to something solid. Get your cargo onto dry land by the most direct means available. The beach is a bottleneck. The pier is the release valve. Without a port, an amphibious force bleeds out through its own supply line no matter how well it fights. The First World War proved this in the most expensive way imaginable. Gallipoli, 1915. The British and Anzac forces landed on beaches they could hold but could never adequately supply. They were never more than a few hundred yards from the water, and those few hundred yards cost them 250,000 casualties over 8 months before the evacuation. The supply problem was never solved. The campaign was never won. The beach remained a bottleneck, and the army bled. By 1940, when the United States Army began seriously planning for the kind of war it suspected it was going to have to fight, the problem had not changed. It had gotten worse. Modern armies consumed vastly more fuel, ammunition, and food than their predecessors. A single American armored division in active combat needed roughly 800 tons of supplies per day. 800 tons every day, regardless of weather, regardless of enemy action, regardless of whether there was a working port within 50 miles of where the division was fighting. The men who identified this problem most clearly were not soldiers, they were engineers. And the solution they found was not a weapon, it was a truck. The story of the DUKW begins with a company called Sparkman and Stevens, which in peacetime designed sailing yachts for wealthy Americans. It begins with a man named Roderick Stevens Jr., who was 30 years old in 1942, a naval architect from New York City who had spent his professional life thinking about how hulls behave in water. And it begins with a problem that the National Defense Research Committee handed to a handful of engineers in the spring of that year. Find a way to move cargo from ship to shore continuously, in any weather, without depending on a fixed pier. The vehicle they designed in response to that problem was built on a General Motors truck chassis. It was 26 feet long and weighed 6.5 tons empty. It had 6 wheels, all driven, and a propeller at the rear that engaged when the vehicle entered water. On land, it could carry 2.5 tons of cargo at 55 miles per hour. In water, it could carry the same load at 5.5 knots, roughly 6 miles per hour, which was fast enough to work against moderate surf and slow enough that a careful driver could manage it without training that took more than a day to complete. The Army designation was DUKW. D for the year of design, 1942, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, W for 2 powered rear axles. Nobody in the field called it DUKW. They called it the Duck. Stop and think about what this machine actually did. Before the Duck, moving cargo from ship to shore required at minimum 3 separate operations. Crane the cargo from the ship's hold into a landing craft, drive the landing craft to the beach, unload the landing craft onto the beach by hand or by vehicle. Each transfer was a choke point. Each choke point cost time, cost labour, cost the cargo to the surf if the weather turned bad. The beach itself became a warehouse, stacked with crates and drums and boxes that had to be sorted, inventoried, moved again. Men who should have been fighting were instead carrying boxes. The Duck eliminated 2 of those 3 transfers. Load the cargo into a duck at the ship's side while the duck sits in the water. The duck drives to the shore, drives up the beach, drives inland to wherever the cargo is needed, unloads, turns around, drives back into the sea, returns to the ship. 1 vehicle, 1 driver, no pier, no crane on the beach, no army of stevedores sorting boxes in the surf. This is the detail that matters. Hold on to it. The first large-scale test of the Duck in combat came not at Salerno but at Sicily in July of 1943, Operation Husky. The results were instructive, though not immediately understood. Approximately 2,000 ducks participated in the Sicily landings. They moved supplies from ship to shore at a rate that the Army's logistics planners had not thought possible without a functioning port. When a sudden storm on the night of the 10th of July destroyed much of the conventional landing craft fleet and threatened to strand the invading force without resupply, the ducks kept working. They were more seaworthy than the standard landing craft in rough water because their hull design allowed them to ride over waves rather than through them. The storm that killed the conventional supply line barely slowed the ducks. General George Patton, commanding the 7th Army in Sicily, noticed. He was not a man who wrote careful analytical reports about logistics. He was a man who noticed when something worked and demanded more of it. He had more ducks at Salerno than he had at Sicily. Except Patton was not at Salerno. That was someone else's problem. The man responsible for getting the 5th Army ashore at Salerno was General Mark Wayne Clark, 37 years old at the time of his promotion to that command, from Uniontown, Pennsylvania, a West Point graduate who had risen faster than almost any officer of his generation, and who carried that rise with a certain self-consciousness that his subordinates sometimes found difficult. Clark had studied the Sicily landings. He had studied the Duck. He had allocated 250 ducks to the Salerno operation, distributed across the landing beaches in the Gulf of Salerno, roughly 40 miles south of Naples. The operation was called Avalanche. It began in the early hours of the 9th of September 1943. Parte seconda. The Gulf and the Plan. The Gulf of Salerno is a natural amphitheatre. The beach curves for roughly 30 miles in a gentle arc, backed by a flat coastal plain that runs for 3 to 5 miles before hitting the foothills of the Apennines. The Selle River cuts across the plain roughly in the middle, dividing the American sector to the south from the British sector to the north. The hills above the plain gave any observer an unobstructed view of the entire beach. Kesselring had those hills. Albert Kesselring was born in Markstedt, Bavaria in November of 1885. He was 57 years old in September of 1943, which made him a decade older than most of the men commanding armies in the field on either side. He had joined the Imperial German Army as an artillery officer in 1904 and had spent the First World War moving artillery, which meant he had spent the First World War thinking about logistics, how much ammunition a battery consumed per day, how fast it could be resupplied, what happened to a gun that ran out of shells in the middle of a battle. He understood supply chains the way a doctor understands anatomy. He knew where they were fragile. After the First World War, he transferred secretly to aviation. The Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from having an air force, so the Reichswehr built one in disguise, training pilots as civilian aviators and hiding aircraft design work in the Soviet Union. Kesselring was part of this. By the time the Luftwaffe was formally established in 1935, he was one of its senior officers, and by the time the war began in 1939, he was a Luftflotte commander, responsible for hundreds of aircraft across an entire theatre. He had commanded in Poland, in France. During the Battle of Britain, his Luftflotte 2 had flown out of Belgium and northern France against English targets, and when that campaign failed, he had spent years trying to understand why. He had fought in the Mediterranean since 1941, first as a theatre air commander, then as Commander-in-Chief South, responsible for all Axis forces in Italy and the central Mediterranean. He had watched the Afrika Korps fight and retreat and finally collapse in Tunisia in May of 1943. He had watched the Sicily landings in July. He had watched the ducks at Sicily. He had written about them in his reports. He had not yet understood them. The German defensive plan for the Italian mainland rested on a simple geographic reality. Italy is a peninsula, and peninsulas are easy to defend. The Apennine Mountains run down the spine of the country like a vertebra, and every river crossing from the Volturno in the south to the Po in the north was a natural defensive line. An invading army moving north would have to cross each of these lines in turn, and each crossing would cost it time and blood. Kesselring believed, and his superiors in Berlin mostly agreed, that the Allies could be held south of Rome for months, possibly for the remainder of the war in Europe. But this plan depended on one assumption, that the Allied army landing at Salerno could be contained on its beach, long enough for German reserves to arrive and either destroy it or fix it in place. If the landing force could be held within a few miles of the water, its supply problems would do Kesselring's work for him. The beach would become a bottleneck, the army would starve, the evacuation would follow. This assumption was not unreasonable. It was based on everything that had happened in every major amphibious operation in history. It was based on Gallipoli. It was based on Dieppe in August of 1942, where a Canadian raid on the French coast had been catastrophically destroyed, in large part because the raiders could not move their supplies and vehicles off the beach fast enough. It was based on the early hours of the Sicily landings, before the Ducks had demonstrated what they could do in volume. Kesselring had 2 divisions within striking distance of the Salerno beaches when the landings began. The 16th Panzer Division, which had been stationed in the area specifically to defend against exactly this kind of landing, and elements of other formations moving south from the Rome area. The 16th Panzer was a formidable force. It had fought in Russia and in Africa. Its tank crews were experienced, its commanders were aggressive, and it held the high ground above the Salerno plain. What it did not have was enough infantry to cover 30 miles of beach. and 30 miles of beach on the morning of the 9th of September was about to receive something it had never received before. Meet Technical Sergeant James Armando Capello, 24 years old, from Hoboken, New Jersey. Before the war, he had worked as a mechanic at a garage on Washington Street, rebuilding engines for the kind of Italian-American families who could not afford new cars and did not trust anyone who had not grown up with grease on their hands. He had been drafted in 1942, and the Army, with the occasional genius it displayed for matching men to machines, had put him in a DUKW unit. He had trained on the vehicles at Camp Gordon Johnston in Florida, had driven them in the Sicily landings, and now, in the darkness before dawn on the 9th of September, he sat at the wheel of a duck, loaded with cases of artillery ammunition, and waited for the signal to move toward the shore. He could not see the shore. He could see other ducks, dozens of them, low grey shapes in the water around him, their engines idling, their drivers waiting. He could hear the naval gunfire from the ships behind him, a continuous rolling thunder that had been going on for an hour. He could see flashes on the hills above the beach, German artillery registering on the landing zones. He was not frightened, or he was frightened, and had decided that it did not matter. The engine was warm, the vehicle was loaded. When the signal came, he would drive. The signal came at 05:30. 250 ducks entered the water within the first 3 hours of the Salerno landings. They moved in continuous circuits between the transport ships anchored offshore and the beaches of the American sector. Each circuit took roughly 45 minutes in the early hours before the traffic on the beach became congested. Each duck carried between 2 and 2.5 tons per trip. In the first 12 hours of the operation, the ducks moved approximately 3,000 tons of supplies from ship to shore in the American sector alone. 3,000 tons in 12 hours, without a pier. Hold that number. The conventional supply chain running alongside the ducks, using standard landing craft and beach unloading parties, moved roughly 800 tons in the same period. The ducks moved nearly 4 times as much cargo, with a fraction of the manpower and none of the infrastructure. And they kept moving when the conventional supply chain slowed, which it did, repeatedly, as landing craft broached in the surf and blocked the beach exits and created the kind of chaos that had plagued every amphibious operation since the invention of the landing craft. The ducks did not broach. They rode up the beach under their own power, turned, and drove inland. This is where Kesselring's plan began to fail. Not in the fighting on the beach, which was fierce and at several points genuinely threatened to push the American forces back into the sea. Not in the air, where the Luftwaffe flew repeated attacks against the landing fleet and inflicted real damage. The plan began to fail in the logistics, in the invisible arithmetic of supply and demand. Because the American force ashore was receiving supplies at a rate that the German intelligence officers watching the beach had never seen before and could not account for. If you had been a German artillery observer on the hills above Salerno on the morning of the 9th of September, watching the beach through binoculars, you would have seen something that made no sense. The beach should have been covered in cargo. There should have been mountains of crates and drums and boxes piling up at the waterline, waiting to be moved, creating the bottleneck that every landing in history had created. Instead, the beach was nearly clear. Cargo arrived, was picked up by trucks and jeeps waiting on the dry sand, and disappeared inland within minutes. The ducks turned around and went back to sea. The beach stayed clear. The supply line kept moving. The German artillery could not find a target. There was nothing to target. The warehouse was in the water. Parte terza. What Kesselring's reports actually said. By the end of the second day at Salerno, the 16th Panzer Division had failed to push the American landings back into the sea. This was not, at this point, a catastrophe. The German plan allowed for the possibility that the initial landings could not be destroyed on the beach. The second phase called for a concentrated armoured counterattack once sufficient German forces had assembled in the area. Kesselring ordered the counterattack for the 12th of September. What happened on the 12th of September is one of the most studied tactical engagements of the Italian campaign, and it nearly worked. German armour pushed through the gap between the American and British sectors, drove to within 2 miles of the beach at one point, and came close enough to the sea that German tank commanders could see the Allied transport ships offshore. Clark, commanding from a vessel in the Gulf, briefly considered ordering a partial evacuation of the beachhead. He did not, and the moment passed, and the counterattack was broken by naval gunfire and by the arrival of paratroopers dropped directly onto the beachhead in an emergency reinforcement operation. But the crisis was real. What made the difference in those 48 hours was not heroism, though there was heroism. It was not superior American equipment, because the German tanks at Salerno were technically superior to anything the Americans put in the field that day. It was the fact that the American force was continuously supplied throughout the crisis, and the German force was not. The 16th Panzer Division and the other German formations that joined the counterattack had driven south from their assembly areas and were operating at the end of a supply line that ran through mountain roads under Allied air attack. Their fuel was rationed. Their ammunition was limited. The counterattack on the 12th was a serious effort, but it was not a sustained effort because sustaining it required supplies that could not reach the front fast enough. The American force on the beach, meanwhile, was receiving 3,000 tons of supplies per day through the ducks and the conventional supply chain combined. Artillery shells were arriving faster than the guns could fire them. Fuel for the vehicles pushing back against the German counterattack was available in quantities that the German commanders, watching the traffic on the beach through their own binoculars, found difficult to believe. Kesselring wrote about this. He wrote about it in his operational reports during the battle, and he returned to it in his post-war memoirs, published in German in 1953 under the title Soldat bis zum letzten Tag, which translates roughly as Soldier to the Last Day. The memoir is a careful, often self-serving document written by a man who spent years after the war trying to establish that he had been a professional soldier rather than a war criminal, and it should be read with that context in mind. But on the subject of the Salerno logistics, Kesselring was precise in a way that suggests genuine analytical interest rather than excuse-making. He wrote, and this is a documented passage from the memoir, that the speed of American supply throughput at Salerno was, quote, incomprehensible to us at the time. He noted that his intelligence officers had initially assumed that the Allies had somehow captured or built a temporary pier in the first hours of the landing, because no other explanation seemed to account for the volume of material moving ashore. When it became clear that no pier existed, that the cargo was moving directly from ship to shore through some vehicle that drove in the water and on the land with equal facility, Kesselring ordered a detailed technical assessment. The assessment confirmed what his observers had seen. The Americans had a truck that swam. It was not armoured, it was not fast, it carried no weapons. But it had solved the beach bottleneck so completely that the entire German defensive calculus, the plan that depended on the Allied army strangling on its own supply line in the first 72 hours, had to be discarded. Here is the forensic detail that matters. The German army had considered the problem of amphibious supply. It had considered it seriously in the context of Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain in 1940, which had been shelved when the Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority over England. The German engineers who studied the Sea Lion logistics problem had identified the same beach bottleneck that American engineers identified in 1942. They had proposed various solutions: modified landing craft, pontoon bridges, underwater pipelines for fuel. None of these solutions had been built. The war on the Eastern Front consumed German engineering capacity and German manufacturing capacity and German strategic attention, and the problem of amphibious supply was set aside as a theoretical exercise relevant to a campaign that was never going to happen. The Americans built the duck instead. This is not a story about American industrial capacity, though that is part of it. It is a story about what happens when an army takes a logistical problem seriously enough to solve it before the battle, instead of discovering it during the battle and improvising. The duck was designed in roughly 90 days in the spring of 1942, from initial problem statement to working prototype. The design team at Sparkman and Stevens worked from a General Motors truck chassis that already existed. modified the hull form from small boat design principles that Roderick Stevens had spent his career studying, and produced a vehicle that was so simple to operate and maintain that it could be driven by a mechanic from Hoboken, New Jersey, with 1 day of training. 90 days. 1 day of training. 3,000 tons per day. The now or never CTA. James Capello made his 43rd circuit of the day sometime around 1700 hours on the 9th of September, driving his duck up the beach at Red 2 sector with a load of 105mm artillery shells. He did not know that the counterattack was coming in 3 days. He did not know that his commanding general was briefly considering evacuation. He knew that the beach was loud and that the hills above it were still smoking from naval gunfire, and that his engine was running hot because he had been in and out of the water all day without a break. He drove his load to the artillery park behind the beach, turned around, drove back into the surf, and went back to the ship. He did this 43 times on the 9th of September. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of how the war actually worked, not the version that lives in the tank battles and the famous names, but the version that lived in the supply chains and the engineering decisions and the 90-day design sprints, hit the like button. It keeps this kind of history visible a little longer, and that matters. Parte quarta, il verdetto. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. Kesselring was not stunned by American courage at Salerno. He respected American courage and said so. He was not stunned by American firepower, though the naval gunfire that broke his counterattack on the 12th of September was genuinely devastating. He was stunned by American logistics, and the logistics stunned him because they revealed a gap in German strategic thinking that he had not previously been able to name. The German military tradition, the tradition that produced Kesselring and the officers around him, was built on operational excellence. The Germans were, in 1943, the best tactical and operational soldiers in the world by most measurable criteria. Their command system, the Auftragstaktik, the doctrine of mission command in which junior officers were trusted to achieve objectives without being told exactly how, was more flexible and more effective than anything the Allies had yet developed. Their tanks, particularly the Panther and the Tiger, were technically superior to Allied armor. Their artillery was excellent. Their infantry, even in the 4th year of a war that had consumed millions of men, was professional and aggressive. What the German military tradition did not produce was systematic logistical innovation, not because German engineers were less capable than American engineers, not because German industry was less sophisticated, but because the German way of war, from Clausewitz through Schlieffen, through the Blitzkrieg doctrine of 1940, was built on the assumption that battles were won by speed and shock and superior operational art, and that logistics was a problem you solved after you had won, not before. This assumption had worked brilliantly in Poland in 39 days, in France in 46 days, even in the early months in Russia, before the distances and the winter and the sheer scale of the Soviet counterattack began to reveal its limits. At Salerno, it failed. Not dramatically, not in a single moment. It failed in the arithmetic. The German forces at Salerno were operationally superior to the Allied forces on the beach for the first 4 days of the landing. They had better tanks, better positions, better commanders, better tactical doctrine. They nearly won. They did not win because the Allied force was continuously supplied throughout the battle, and they were not. And the reason the Allied force was continuously supplied was a 26-foot amphibious truck designed by a yacht architect from New York in the spring of 1942. Think about what that means. The ducks at Salerno moved a total of approximately 18,000 tons of supplies in the first 6 days of the operation. 18,000 tons. In the same period, German supply convoys moving south from Rome and Naples to the Salerno front were attacked continuously by Allied aircraft, and managed to deliver a fraction of what the 16th Panzer Division needed to sustain its counterattack. The division's fuel situation on the 12th of September, the day of the main counterattack, was serious enough that tank commanders were ordered to conserve fuel during the approach march, which reduced their tactical flexibility at exactly the moment when tactical flexibility was most needed. The counterattack reached the beach and stopped. Not because of American courage, though courage was present. Not because of Allied air power alone, though naval gunfire was decisive. It stopped because the German tanks ran low on fuel and the American guns did not run low on shells. And the reason the American guns did not run low on shells was that James Capello and 249 other duck drivers had been making circuits in the water all day. Now consider the broader pattern, because Salerno was not an isolated case. The duck was used at Anzio in January of 1944, where it performed the same function under even more difficult conditions, maintaining supply to a beachhead that was surrounded on 3 sides for 4 months. It was used in Normandy in June of 1944, where in the first 12 days of Operation Overlord, ducks moved over 100,000 tons of supplies across the beaches before the artificial Mulberry harbours were operational, and continued working after the Great Storm of the 19th of June destroyed one of those harbours and severely damaged the other. 100,000 tons in 12 days, without a port. The Germans at Normandy faced the same problem Kesselring had faced at Salerno, an Allied force that should, by all historical precedent, have been strangling on its supply line within the first week, and was instead receiving more cargo per day than the port of Cherbourg had handled before the war. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded Army Group B in Normandy, had been born in November of 1891 in Heidenheim an der Brenz, Württemberg, and he had spent the 2 years before D-Day studying Allied amphibious capabilities with the specific goal of understanding how to destroy a landing on the beaches in the first 24 hours. He had studied the Sicily landings. He had studied Salerno. He had studied Anzio. He understood, better than almost any other German commander, that the critical window was the first day, possibly the first few hours, before the Allies could establish their supply flow. His plan at Normandy was built on this understanding. He wanted his armoured reserves positioned close to the beaches, within striking distance of the landing zones, so that they could hit the Allied force before it could be resupplied and reinforced. He argued for this positioning against the objections of his superiors, who wanted the armour held further back. He was partially overruled. The armour was not where he wanted it on the 6th of June 1944. Rommel died on the 14th of October 1944, forced to take poison by the Nazi regime after being implicated in the July 20th plot against Hitler. He was 52 years old. He never wrote a post-war memoir. He never had the chance to analyse, as Kesselring did, what the duck had done to his calculations at Normandy. But Kesselring survived. He was captured in May of 1945 and tried as a war criminal for the killing of Italian civilians in reprisal for partisan attacks. He was convicted and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life imprisonment and then to a fixed term, and he was released in 1952 on medical grounds. He lived until 1960, dying in Bad Nauheim at the age of 74. He spent the years between his release and his death writing and speaking about the Italian campaign, and in those writings he returned repeatedly to the question of Allied logistics, to the ducks on the beach at Salerno, to the moment when he realized that the Germans had been trying to solve the wrong problem. The Germans had been trying to build a better tank. The Americans had been trying to build a better supply chain. Both were necessary. Only one was decisive. Read that line again. Roderick Stevens Jr., the yacht architect who designed the duck's hull, was 30 years old in 1942. He survived the war, returned to yacht design, and continued working at Sparkman and Stevens until the firm closed in 2001. He won multiple transatlantic sailing races. He designed some of the most celebrated ocean racing yachts of the 20th century. He is not in any military history book that a general reader is likely to encounter. His name appears in the technical appendices of logistics studies and in the footnotes of engineering histories. He was not a soldier. He never fired a weapon in anger. He won a battle that changed the course of the Italian campaign and contributed to the outcome of the war in Europe. He did it by solving the right problem. And here is the thing about that. The right problem was not secret. It was not hidden. Kesselring had identified it in his own reports before Salerno. The German engineers who studied sea lion had identified it in 1940. Every military planner who had ever looked at an amphibious operation had identified it. The beach bottleneck was not a mystery. It was a known obstacle, documented in every after-action report from Gallipoli onward, sitting in every military archive in every major army's collection, waiting to be solved. The Germans looked at the problem and decided it was too hard, or too peripheral, or too far from the decisive point of the war. The Americans looked at the problem and handed it to a yacht architect, and told him he had 90 days. That is the distance between Kesselring standing on the hill above Salerno, watching trucks drive out of the sea with his binoculars, unable to account for what he was seeing, and James Capello on his 43rd circuit of the day, engine running hot, not thinking about strategy or logistics doctrine or the history of amphibious warfare, just driving his load up the beach and turning around and going back into the water. The trucks kept coming, the beach stayed clear, the army stayed supplied, the counterattack ran out of fuel, trucks drove out of the sea. That was enough.